Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you briefly about the pros and cons of living in Europe and Latin America. Now of course, can't generalize much, but there are general characteristics that most European countries and most Latin American countries share. For instance, I'll start with Europe, and the pros and cons are actually pretty simple and straightforward. The main advantage of being in Europe is that it's safe. If you take the least safe country in Europe, like say Ukraine before the war, you take the raw statistics for murder rates and violent robbery, it's still about on par with some of the safest countries in Latin America, like say Uruguay, or if you take the safest state in Brazil, Santa Catarina, it's still slightly more dangerous than Ukraine. Or if you take the north of Chile, there you're gonna find statistics that are about crime statistics that are about on par with the most dangerous places in Europe. So Europe is safer. That's one huge advantage of Europe. The second advantage of being in Europe is that it's very walkable. That cities are designed for foot traffic. They're meant for you to walk, to get around by public transport or on foot. Now in Latin America, that's not so. In most places, Latin America is more like the United States. In that sense, you will need to use Uber. You will probably maybe rent a car. I would not count on public transport, especially if you don't know the area. It's just not safe. So the third advantage of being in Europe is that there's cultural sophistication. Museums, architecture, a lot of human capital. This is probably an interesting place to meet expats who are cultured and refined. Of course, you can find them in Latin America too, but you're going to be more likely to find that, to have better luck with that in Europe. So these are the three advantages: cultural sophistication, walkability, and safety. Now, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of being in Europe. One of the key disadvantages of being in Europe is that unless you have a European ancestry, and I mean ancestry dating back to going to a country in the European Union, it's going to be a challenge for you to become a legal resident. Most Latin American countries are much easier to work with. Now, bureaucracy in places like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico can be cumbersome and difficult to get around. But it's still much easier to become a resident of Brazil or Mexico than, say, to become a resident of Slovakia or Hungary or Spain, for that matter, when you don't have any ethnic links connecting you to the European Union. So that's a minus of being in Europe. It's difficult to blend in legally, and another issue is that most European societies tend to be race and class conscious. That, for example, Spain and Portugal tend to be segregated along class lines. Now, in Spain, where I've lived for a year and a half, I've noticed that the Spanish mostly keep to themselves and the expats keep to themselves. In Portugal, there was a bit more mixing going on, but my experience in Spain has been that the only Spanish people with whom I could interact were people who had some experience living abroad, or who had a family living abroad, who are used to talking to foreigners. And living in Spain, I've had a pretty difficult time connecting to the locals. Now, in Latin America, in Brazil and Mexico, it's the opposite. I've had a much easier time relating to locals. There were people who were much warmer and more forthcoming. When I lived in Serbia, I generally was received well because, well, I'm originally from Russia. But I also noticed that there was a pretty strict barrier between foreigners and locals. I think that is just the European way of life. There was a bit of segregation on the account of ethnicity, race, and class. You see less of that. There are some classism, some racism, some xenophobia in Latin American societies, but it's just not nearly as significant as it is in Europe. And lastly, the third advantage of being in Latin America, and the third disadvantage of being in Europe, the Latin American countries are generally much more affordable. For example, now I live in the south of Brazil, in Santa Catarina, one of the best places in Brazil, in all Latin America. And the kind of prices that I get here are pretty difficult to find in Europe. So cost of living is definitely a huge advantage to being in South America. So to sum it up, Europe is generally more expensive but also safer. It's generally more culturally refined in most places, but it's also there are also more issues with classes, racism, segregation, and of course one advantage to being in Europe, one last advantage, is that it tends to be a bit more stable politically. That while there are some riots and demonstrations, this does not quite happen as much as it does in a lot of Latin American countries. For example, in Argentina, there are riots every week in Buenos Aires. There's some of that in the south of Brazil. There's plenty more than in Paraguay. So if you're looking for predictability and stability, Europe is for you. But if you're looking for affordable lifestyle where it's easier to get your papers, where you can connect with the local culture, then South Latin America is a better fit for you. Though my personal opinion is that the south of Brazil offers the best of both worlds. You know, the Latin American advantages of low cost of living and accessible locals, tolerable bureaucracy, and at the same time the advantages of a European society, that it's fairly safe, it's cultured, it's organized, and of course it's stable. That's it for now. You'll be hearing from me